So for me, like the way I understand the technology right now, and it's always a bit weird because it feels like nobody actually 100% knows how it works, right? Which makes it so hard for everybody to navigate this, right? But the way I understand is that an inherent feature of this technology is the non-determinism, right? So, hallucinations is the key feature, right? We just call it hallucination when it does something that we don't want, and we call it intelligence when it does the thing that we want, right?
Hey, Luca here. Welcome to a new episode of the Refactoring Podcast, where every 2 weeks we interview a world-class tech leader. Today's guest is Birgitta Böckeler, who is Distinguished Engineer and Global Lead for AI-assisted software delivery at ThoughtWorks. So her full-time work is to figure out how engineering teams can make the most out of AI. And today I'm here to ask. So with Birgitta, we talked about her favorite workflows, how she uses AI in the IDE, in the terminal, or in agentic mode. We discussed the AI impact on productivity and what the best teams are getting right, which others are not. And finally, we talked about how AI impacts both junior and senior engineers and how we can get the best out of both skeptics and optimists. So let's dive right into the action. Welcome, Birgitta, and thank you so much for being here with us today.
Yeah, hi, Luca. Thanks for having me.
So, Birgitta, you are a distinguished engineer and global lead for AI-assisted software delivery at ThoughtWorks. And so my very first question is, you have a very peculiar role at ThoughtWorks. How would you describe it?
Yeah, I don't know if I would call it peculiar, but it is indeed like I haven't seen a role like that at any of the other consultancies so far.
Yeah.
So ThoughtWorks is a software consultancy. So we're a global
Yes.
company with about 10,000, 11,000 people at this point. And about 2 years ago, I think it was in June 2023, we decided to introduce a full-time role for somebody to kind of become a subject matter expert in this topic. So how do we use AI for software delivery? So June 2023 was kind of around the time that GitHub Copilot started becoming a lot more
Yes.
popular. This was about half a year, 8 months after ChatGPT
Yeah.
came out and created waves, right? And it was already quite obvious that there was something happening here that would fundamentally change a lot of the parts of software delivery. So
Yeah.
the company decided to have somebody kind of look into it full time, and I was lucky enough to be at the right place at the right time with the right qualifications. So so you can imagine it kind of like a developer advocate, subject matter expert. It's like both internally and externally kind of representing this topic for ThoughtWorks.
Yeah, I love it because in 2023, yes, we had GitHub Copilot, and we could imagine that it would become something big with all the other tools in AI development, but it was still quite early. So to think to have a full-time role dedicated on this, it was quite prescient and very right in hindsight. Did you expect such an fast evolution over the last couple of years?
I mean, at the time, like now it seems like that was early, right? But as is the nature of this hype, even at that time, we felt like, oh my God,
we are late.
We're late. Exactly. So in hindsight, it feels like it was actually early, but these days you constantly feel like you might not be on top. You don't know what's happening. Things change all the time, right? It can be quite intense and stressful.
Yes, absolutely. I mean, I think it's for all of us. Even if you're completely inside this every day, you still feel like you're not on top of things. Still feels you're late all the time. Hey, before we continue, I want to tell you more about today's sponsor, which is Augment Code. Augment is the only AI coding platform built for real engineering teams, not to vibe code, but to make real progress. And that's because Augment truly understands your code base. It has a custom-built context engine that takes into account every repo and every file in your stack, scaling nicely to tens of millions of lines of code. So it can actually help to write functions, fix CI/CD issues, triage incidents, and review PRs, all from your IDE or from your terminal. Learn more on augmentcode.com. So what does a day in the life or work of Birgitta looks like?
Yeah, maybe, let me just look at my calendar for this week,
Yes,
maybe, right? So give some
yes.
examples, right? So this week already, like, for example, I had like a casual catch up with two of the other distinguished engineers in ThoughtWorks,
Mm,
Keith Morris, who is the author of the Infrastructure's Codebook, and James Lewis, who's like well-known figure in the microservices space and, talking about continuous delivery and flow and stuff like that. So two of my colleagues that I really love working with them and getting their input. So I catch up with them regularly to talk to them about what's going on and,
yes.
share our opinions and rants on what's going on in the AI space. I was talking to one of our teams that is doing some interesting experiments around like generating code bases just from requirements documents. And I was trying to use
Yeah.
their setup and going back and forth with them. I think a lot about, sharing, internal
Yes.
sharing first, but also
Yes.
external sharing. So I was talking to some folks about, some like slides. I'm a slide machine as well these days, creating
Yes.
overviews that represent experiences that we're seeing so we can share them with our clients. I had one session already this week and we'll have another one just discussing with an executive team at one of our clients or with two of them, just having discussions like we call them like AI for software state of play sessions, just I bring
Yeah.
some material and then we have a discussion and I respond to their questions. And finally, I'm also like working on a lot of my own experiments, getting my hands dirty all the
Yeah.
time. So this week in particular, I was playing around with using Claude Code in GitHub
Yeah.
Actions. So kind of like running a larger Claude Code workflow
Yeah.
in GitHub Actions. And I'm also experimenting a lot right now with ideas of, if we really want to generate larger change sets with coding
Yeah.
assistants or coding agents, then what are maybe different ways that can help make it easier for us to review a large change set and assess its risk? So it's
Yeah.
like a whole bunch of, kind of like hands-on networking, talking to other people, talking to our clients. It's a
Yeah.
lot of different things.
Yeah, I love it. And so do you have, when it comes to yourself, to your experimentations, like a preferred workflow set of tools? Because there is no consensus on even on the ergonomics, let's say, of AI coding
Yeah,
tools.
yeah, yeah.
There are some who run in the terminal, some are just like augmented IDEs, some are like autonomous agents, although at least they try.
Yeah.
So is there a preferred way for you to use these tools, or you just experiment with many of this stuff?
Yeah, I mean, part of my role is that I need to try different things, right?
Of
Like,
course.
so there are some days where I have 5 different IDs open. And so I jump back and forth between them. At the moment, I use Windsurf a lot, and Claude Code definitely has like a big moment right now and is
Yes.
in a lot of ways in its feature set at the frontier right now. They're doing some really
Yeah.
interesting stuff with the hooks and sub agents and all of that.
Yeah.
Yeah, there's the IDE versus terminal base. That is one of the, let's say, dimensions, right?
Yeah.
Where you have different boxes. I have to say, like, I'm a fan of having this in the IDE because there are a lot of tools in the IDE that help me keep an overview of stuff, right? So I have my Git
Yes.
diff right there that I can look at. And the coding assistants also, the deeper they get integrated into the IDE, the more information they have about the code base, right? So just think
Yes.
about linting errors and stuff like that, right? Although Claude Code is, at least with the linting errors, they can do some stuff. But anyway, there's a lot more potential there, right? I'm just waiting for the day when they can also like access the debugger or access the refactoring functionalities of the IDEs and stuff like that, right?
Yeah.
Having said that, I can also see why so many people appreciate Claude Code right now, and they really
Yeah.
embrace that user experience of the terminal and are doing stuff with
Yes.
that so many of us love and make us effective, right? So there's also something to be said about that, right? So that's,
Yeah.
I think, one of the dividing lines, terminal-based, IDE-based.
Yes.
And then another kind of dimension is this, like, it's running in my tools and I'm driving the session and I'm the human in the loop. And the other one is these autonomous background agents, right? That are coming
Yes.
out more and more now, like OpenAI Codex, Cursor has these. I don't know if Windsurf has them now as well. Like I
Yeah.
said, I can run Claude Code in GitHub Actions, so that would also be an autonomous agent that runs without my supervision, right?
Yeah.
And there it's interesting because it goes back to what I was mentioning before. When you send off an agent and it creates, especially when it creates a large change set, then I just look at it when it's done. I have to think a lot about the risk and, review everything at once.
Yeah.
Whereas when I have like a session where I'm the human in the loop, I can kind of go step by step and review step by step, right? So
Yeah.
I'm still a lot more in favor of the augmentation
Yeah.
workflow. And I also, have a lot of questions still about, will there ever be a point in time when I will feel comfortable generating and deploying
Yeah.
thousands of lines of code at a time when in situations where maybe I'll be on call for that code, right?
Yeah,
It depends,
exactly.
of course, right? It can be
Yeah.
something a lot smaller. But just to take one of those extreme cases, right? Thousands of lines of code for a critical application is an extreme, right?
Yeah.
So yeah, I don't have anything definitely preferred. There are a bunch of good tools there at the moment, actually. Yeah.
Yeah, so much food for thought already. So I wanted to ask, because you mentioned the difference between leaving more space for AI to create big change sets versus instead creating small changes at a time. Do you think that you being uncomfortable with having like thousands of lines of code generated at a single time is more about the fact that the models and the AI still not there, makes many errors and stuff, or it's just, basic hygiene, just like we always say, create small PRs, create small change sets, even for humans, right? So maybe we'll never get there. So it will always be like a bad practice. What do you think?
Yeah, one thing is, of course, just the nature of large change sets, regardless of how they were created,
Yeah.
that increases our risk when we do continuous delivery or maybe even continuous deployment, right? Because the larger the change set is, even if all the commits are super small, if I deploy 150 commits at the same time,
Yes.
and then something goes wrong, the larger the whole deployment was, the harder it will be for me to find what went wrong, right? So that's
Yes.
the whole idea of like multiple deploys a day, even when you just deploy and don't release anything new,
Yes.
right? The idea is that you kind of have this routine and you have like stability, and it's counterintuitive, but it actually reduces your risk, right?
Yes.
So that's one thing. That's a big question mark for me.
Yeah.
Will the trade-off really work out, right?
Yes.
Will this trade-off of like, we accept this increased risk, but because AI gives us so many other benefits, we accept that, right?
Yeah.
And then the second thing is about like what you were saying about, do the models just have to get better, right?
Yeah.
So for me, like the way I understand the technology right now, and it's always a bit weird because it feels like nobody actually 100% knows how it works, right? Which makes it so hard for everybody to navigate this, right? But the way I understand is that an inherent feature of this technology is the non-determinism, right? So, hallucinations is the key feature, right? We just call it hallucination when it does something that we don't want, and we call it intelligence when it does the thing that we want, right? But
Love
that's the
this.
key feature, right? So I cannot imagine with large language models that there will ever be a time where there's a non-negligible probability that they will not do something that I don't want. Okay, I tied myself in knots there with a lot of negations,
I
but you know
got
what
it.
you know what I mean, right?
Yes. Yes.
So there will
totally.
always be some non-zero probability that it does something that I did not want.
Yes.
Also because there's also a non-zero probability that we forget to specify something, or that we're not good at specifying something, right? So I see it fill in gaps in my specifications all the time with assumptions, right?
Yeah.
So and so with that remaining probability then also comes that it's a wide variety of things that it might do wrong, right?
Yeah.
It might misunderstand something about the functionality. It might create like a little piece of insecure code here and there, or it might. So there's all of these things that can go wrong. So the larger a workflow is, the higher the probability that something will go wrong, right? And especially if it's just small things, it will be hard for me as a human to find those, right?
Yeah.
So then if we want that, if we, let's say, take that as a fact that we want that in the future, then we have to think about our future testing strategies, our future reviewing experience, all of those things, right? Like, how will we know as the human that AI actually did what we wanted?
Yes. No, I totally agree. I mean, I don't know what's the best workflow, but there are just so many, let's say, aspects that hint to me at the fact that for now, for me, it's better to just keep a tight feedback loop. You know, on one side, you check for errors. Other side, I don't want to get lazy myself. You know, I want to stay engaged and don't lose track of what's happening. And so, yeah, I think. I mean, for myself, it's a little bit of a better workflow to stay on top of small changes as opposed to just
Yeah, yeah,
giving them free leeway.
yeah.
But I also want to go back. You mentioned Cloud Code having a big moment right now, which is what I see as well. I remember when Cloud Code came out, there was already Cursor, there was Windsurf, probably, I think, of course, Copilot. And it felt like the most natural way of integrating AI was inside the IDE. So I remember Cloud Code felt like a very opinionated take, you know, on how engineers would want to use AI in their coding. So what do you think that they got right? They are getting right to win so many engineers to use the terminal over simply an IDE like Cursor.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, like I said before, there's something about embracing that terminal experience. And to be honest, I think one of the things that I think it boils down to is usage with the keyboard.
Yeah.
So when you're in the terminal, it's a lot even easier than the IDE. I mean, there are some people who are super good with all the shortcuts in the IDE. In my heyday of like writing code almost all day, I would hardly touch the mouse, right? I forgot a
Yes.
lot of those, right? But in the terminal, it's even easier, right? And so they're embracing some of those things like with, commands and all of those things. Everything is kind of like at your fingertip with like one or two keystrokes, So
Yeah.
I think that's one of the things that maybe people like about it.
Yeah.
And then, yeah, I think they're just thinking more in general at Anthropic. They seem to be thinking a lot about the ecosystem and what possible integrations you have, right? They showed that with MCP, like releasing
Yes.
MCP. And now they're doing stuff like hooks, right, in Cloud Code, which
Yes.
I haven't seen in any of the other assistants yet.
Yeah,
I
true.
might just have missed it because there's so many of them now. But so hooks, this idea that you can actually hook in with different scripts and actions, like every time a terminal command is called or every time an MCP server is called. So I've been experimenting with like kind of logging some of the stuff that's going on, so to make it easier to review. I think other use cases that they suggest is things like guardrails, right? When
Yeah.
certain commands are called, you kind of like try to suppress that, right? So yeah, they seem to be thinking a lot about this ecosystem idea and to
Yeah.
give people even more possibilities to integrate their own style and flavor and requirements of what they need from a coding agent.
Yeah, I agree. I think that out of the big companies creating frontier models seem to be the one more geared towards developers and towards coding, both when it comes to the models themselves that
Yeah.
seems to be slightly better than others, but also the tools. So yeah, I agree.
Yeah, when you were asking me about like what tools I used before, and I said I'm using a lot of them, the one constant is that I use Claude Sonnet models in all of them.
Yeah, that's what I hear. Yes,
Yeah.
absolutely. And so you mentioned a lot of experimentation, but inside ThoughtWorks, were you able to create some guidelines? Do you have some like top-down ideas that get implemented by all teams, or it's more like bottom-up experimentation across the various teams about what to use, how to use it? How does it work?
Yeah. Yeah, that's another big challenge right now that comes with the nature of the hype and the speed. That it's really hard to kind of create guidance that
Yeah.
stands the test of time, right?
Yes.
Formal training, a lot of organizations are struggling with that right now. They want to help their people understand AI, but formal training takes some time to develop, and then you want to run it for a while until you have to update the material again, and then it's already outdated, right? And it's the same
Yes.
with this guidance. One thing I found is that a lot of the advice I put together actually very much in the early days, that was more general advice around the human aspect of how we should approach this technology, like being careful of certain cognitive biases that this kind of triggers because it's such a manipulative technology, right? Just like basic advice, like you're still in charge, and there's a lot of that type of advice in that bucket that hasn't changed that much in 2 years, actually. The
Yeah.
thing that changes all the time is this like the possibilities of what you can actually technically do, right? Especially since the agents, kind of the agentic modes, came around like end of last year, beginning of this year, because it changes the footprint so much, also in terms of risk and
Yes.
supply chain security, and there's more and more stories about that. So yeah, there's kind of like almost like a funnel I think about. So we try to get everybody sharing in chat, like social learning,
Yeah.
sharing with each other as much as possible. So that's kind of the first line of defense, let's say, right? So I'd rather dump something imperfect somewhere into our chat room than not write anything or share anything about it at all, right?
Yeah.
And then sometimes those things kind of bubble up into more reusable documents, and there's like multiple people in ThoughtWorks that take initiative, and they've done this at a client, and then they write a document, and we try to like curate a list of documents that people can go to. But it's hard for everybody to navigate, especially for people who maybe for a while we have still a lot of clients who don't allow people to use coding assistants. So sometimes people come out of those engagements and then are starting to get into it, and then they're overwhelmed by all the information available, right? But definitely there's some like core guidance, but it has to be heavily like supported with social learning and sharing.
Yeah, I mean, we are still at the point where sharing is the most important thing and learning all together rather than, I think, top-down strict guidance that, I mean, tomorrow will be obsolete, I think. Yeah. And when I speak with companies and team leaders, I think one of the biggest struggles at deploying AI is figuring out what's the impact, right, on productivity, on value, and for once, because there are so many contrasting views. I mean, on one side, you hear many bold claims, either from individual engineers or sometimes entire companies like big tech about the amount of code that is now being written by AI. On the other side, there is more and more research that actually shows that team productivity gains from AI are, I mean, dubious, between 10, 15% at most, sometimes negative. So why do you think there is such a contrast?
Yeah. I think that the contrast in part comes from the fact that generative AI is such a Swiss Army knife. So, you can work on something where it feels like you could do something in 2 minutes that otherwise would have taken you 2 hours.
Yeah.
And then next time you're working on something and it actually gets it wrong multiple times, or you have to review a lot, and suddenly it feels like it didn't even save you any time, or it even took longer, right? And sometimes it's depending on what the last experience was that you had, or what the first experiences were that you had when you went into it. You land on like one of the extremes, maybe, right? These polarizing extremes of it's not useful at all, or it's like, oh my God, it's like we won't need developers anymore, right? So I think that's one thing, that there's so many different use cases, and that also kind of skews all of this this impact speculation, right? Because if there was ever a technology where we would say it depends on how useful it is, then it's this technology, right? I mean, I'm a consultant. It's a common consulting trope that we say it depends all the time, right? But it's super true here, right? So I was just looking at a list the other day of things that teams had reported of what they use Gen AI for. It's like, oh, we saved 70% of time converting SQL scripts, or, like, so it was all these specific examples of what in their particular situation they used it for. And then maybe for other things, it's not useful to them at all, because maybe they're using like a proprietary library that the LLM doesn't know, and they haven't found a way yet to teach it how to use that, right? So that's one thing that is just like a little bit all over the place, and it depends on so many factors. And then I think the other thing is that just the ballpark in general, because coding is just one part of so many things that teams do. People forget, like when they think about these percentages, right? That percentage is relative, right? So if the team only spends 30% of their time coding, then you cannot get over like a, let's say, 15 to 20% increase in speed as a team as a whole. You just can't, right? And that's like the very, very good scenario, right? So you have to look at like other places as well, and you also have to look just at like good old engineering practices and engineering processes, right? If your continuous integration and automation setup is a mess, and so that means that your developers always having a really hard time deploying because they feel like they have to manually double check so many things, then giving them a coding assistant to write code faster is not going to resolve that bottleneck, right?
Yeah.
And also, generative AI amplifies indiscriminately. So if you have a lot of bad code, you might actually create more bad code, right? So there's
Yeah.
just so many dimensions to this that I'm not surprised that it's so elusive, this number, this
Yeah.
magic percentage number that everybody wants to
Yeah.
know, right?
Yeah, so what we are saying basically is that it's not only elusive because it's generally hard to calculate, but it's also that you may have a generally completely different experience and different impact based
Yeah.
on how your team works. So
Yeah.
there are, I mean, if it seems like there are teams who are getting, 10x the impact versus the other teams out of AI, it's because sometimes
Yeah.
it's true because of how the team works.
Yeah,
Is that right?
It's like, are you currently writing a lot of code from scratch versus do you have to change a lot of existing code? What is the tech stack you're using? How convoluted and entangled is your code base,
Yes.
right? Because
Yes.
that's not only hard for humans, that's also hard for AI, right?
Yes.
Or if you have a lot of duplicate code or like it's very, just convoluted, AI also doesn't deal very well with it, right? Or it's even things like some experienced developers will get a huge boost, some won't, right? Just imagine somebody who is, like I said before, like a wizard in IntelliJ, right?
Yes.
And working in a tech stack that they've worked in for 5 years. They know the code base inside out. They go bam, 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 shortcuts, done. They're not going to get a 50% task completion increase, like because they're already very, very fast in what they're doing, right?
Yes.
And junior developers, again, they might be a lot slower because, they might run into a lot of pitfalls and believe AI things that, maybe are a bad idea. Or some of them, in some situations, will be a lot faster because they can learn faster with AI and they don't depend as much on asking questions to more senior engineers around them, right?
Yeah.
So there's just so many dimensions to it. It's
Yeah. If you had to say what is it when you think at teams that are getting the most out of AI that you know of, what is it that they're getting right, or what is it about their work that allows them to get a lot out of it?
I always talk about that tension and the dynamics between the extremes that we have right now, right? I just mentioned it as well. This like some people think, oh my God, this is changing everything. Look what it just did, right? And then on the other extreme, you have like total skeptics. Doesn't help me at all, right? And I think the teams that can get the most out of this have this like magical combination of a lot of critical thinking, like really looking at like what did AI just do, and not just like treat it like a party trick and say, look, it created some code, right? But actually look at what it did and think about, oh, what does this mean? Like, how can we adapt our process to mitigate some of the risks that we see? How can we use hooks? How can we use, reusable prompts and commands, right? So really like this critical thinking, and then combining that with like still being very ambitious about it, and maybe having some of those magical thinkers who sometimes say, hey, why don't we try this? Like, even if it seems ridiculous at first, right? So I think that's like a really good kind of culture where you also reward both sides and don't say, or you're too skeptic, or like, why would you even think that would work, right?
Yes.
So yeah, critical thinking married with like some ambition and some like excitement still about this and trying things. I think that's the key.
Yeah, so you have to always reward critical thinking, whether it's skepticism or optimism. If it's grounded, and backed by real experiments and grounded in your reality, you should encourage that and reward that.
Yeah. And again, the difficulty right now is that sometimes you can't even ground it in anything because it's so hard to like, you can't even sometimes prove that these custom instructions that you put into Cursor actually made things better, right? You can just say, yeah, it kind of feels like everything got better, but I don't know
Yeah.
if it's those 3 rules or if it's those 10 over there, you know?
Yeah.
So that makes it, again, especially harder. Like sometimes you can't even properly critically think
Yeah.
because it would take too much time to actually figure out what was the little knob that I turned that actually made it better, you know?
Yeah. Yeah, and one of the biggest challenges, I think you mentioned this before, that everybody's saying is that when you have large code bases that maybe are a little bit messy, not 100% documented in some parts, it feels like AI coding assistants rapidly become very ineffective, right?
Yeah.
So is that true in your experience, or
Yeah.
do you have any advice to make it better?
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, again, here there's two sides to it, right? On the one hand, maybe sending an agent off to do a large task is a lot more risky, or like there's a lot more that can go wrong. On the other hand, there are all of these anecdotes about people like who've been struggling with the code base like that or with a bug in a code base like that, and suddenly, you know, AI can help them solve their big whale kind of bug in like 10 minutes, right? So
Yeah.
I think when it comes to existing code bases, AI maybe has a bit more value in this kind of like, okay, what's actually going on? You know,
Mm.
like sometimes helping you find places in the code base. But I would be careful kind of doing tasks that are too large with it, and also doing things in places that I have really no idea what's going on, right? Because
Yeah.
that also sometimes can make your prompts to AI not as good when you don't know the consequences, right? So I have worked with AI in existing code bases, maybe not in like super bad, super big ones, but I've worked in existing code bases, and I do feel like it often gives me a boost. But I have to think even more about like how do I break down the tasks, how do I make them smaller. I often kind of like see it go off the rails, then revert, and then
Yeah.
I've learned from what it did wrong and kind of can either give it a better prompt or I can do it myself. So I then often feel I send it off, and then it helps me kind of refine my plan of what I actually wanted to do in this code base that is maybe a little
Yeah.
bit convoluted. So it's more this kind of, let's say, second line help,
Yeah.
you know?
Yes.
Also thinking about the code and thinking about solutions.
Yeah, and have you found there are like design patterns or code organization strategies that particularly help AI, or is it just that what's good for humans in terms of organization is good for AI too?
Yeah. Yeah, mostly so far that has been my conclusion. What's good for humans is usually good for AI as well, especially when
Yeah.
it comes to stuff like modularization, right?
Mm.
Like when, you know, when you have requirements and you feel like every time you get a requirement, you have to change 20 places, 20 very different places in the code base, that's usually a smell that something's off, right? That somehow the
Yeah.
code structure doesn't match the domain or something that's going on, right? And AI, of course, will also struggle having to change 20 places, as opposed to, you know, maybe I can just point it at one folder or one package and say, this is the module where we need to change something, so that, you know, all the other modules can then take advantage of this, right? So it's the same idea of like kind of encapsulation and having interfaces between things. So yeah, so far that's been my conclusion. I found a few smaller things, maybe not so much with design, but I found things like logging settings, right? So I was building something with AI, and part of that were end-to-end tests. So the agent was starting the application and running the end-to-end tests, but then it didn't have access to the log, so it couldn't actually
Yeah.
see what went wrong, right? So I
Yes.
kind of had to go and change the log settings for my local logging so it could access the log file. And then at some point, I realized that after two messages, my context window was already full, and the agent, for some reason, had loaded the full log file, right? So then I would go back to the log configuration and kind of change the rollover window, right? So it's like a small example, but that was like, yeah, an example of how maybe some of the local development setup, you know, you
Yes.
kind of change it a little bit to make it more convenient for an agent in particular.
Yeah. And speaking of, you mentioned giving an agent access to logs. Have you found there are some specific tools, MCPs that you routinely give agents access that significantly improve the coding experience?
I mean, I'm not using that many MCP servers out of the box, but my use cases are also not like the normal use cases of a project team because I'm not on a project like on a or
Yeah.
on a delivery team right now, right? So I recently used like the Playwright MCP server from Microsoft a lot because I
Yes.
was experimenting with browsing web interfaces and what you can do with that. I find myself very frequently building custom MCP servers for what I'm doing because it's super easy to build an MCP server. Some coding
Yes.
assistants are really good at it.
Yeah.
So that's one of the things that I often vibe code actually, like at least when it's something that's like not critical and it's just doing read access to something simple, right? So I know there's
Yeah.
not much risk. So then I often vibe code those, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, and also because I can also imagine in the future, like if we use too many heavyweight MCP servers and we always have them all activated, like each of those is going to take part of our context window as well, right? And it's going to potentially distract the model from what it's actually supposed to do. So there might actually be a place for like much more like targeted, customized, like this is exactly what we need for our use case type of MCP servers. But because you were talking about access to logs, maybe you had a specific use case in mind, and
Might be
I
one of
didn't
them.
have,
Yeah.
I didn't have this use case yet, but there's this interesting idea of giving agents access to observability data through MCP servers, right? So, and there's a bunch of my colleagues who have experimented with that and kind of this idea of getting that information and helping you resolve incidents faster, right?
Yes.
And I think that's quite interesting. Like just in general, generative AI and large language models has unlocked this new way of accessing and searching information for us, right? That it is has so much potential for us in software engineering because we're so overwhelmed by so many sources of information that we have to
Yeah.
go to fix things, to think about how to build things in the right way, and so on and so on.
Yeah, yeah. But by the way, the people I speak with generally do not report that many use cases for MCPs. I mean, it feels a little bit underwhelming so far. Or, I mean, if you overdo that, things rapidly become extremely slow, extremely costly.
Yeah.
Because
Yeah.
I mean, ideally, it makes sense. You can think of giving access the model like up-to-date documentation through MCPs or static analysis, whatever. I mean, many things. But then every call that you make takes like 10 seconds and consumes so many tokens, and the
Yeah.
experience degrades. So feels like we're still in the stage where
Yeah.
we need to optimize things a little bit.
Yeah, yeah. An interesting one that I tried recently that I've been wondering, I would love it if like one of our teams would try that out to tell me if that's useful, is we created like a reference application for like, I mean, we were experimenting with like, this was a Spring Boot application. So like quite a common type of code base in a lot of places, and also in a lot of larger programs where you have lots of teams building lots of services based on one particular framework, right? So this reference application and then an MCP server that could provide like, give me a sample entity, give me a sample repository, give me a sample controller test, right? So because large language models react quite well to examples, right? So you give them like, giving them code examples is almost the most effective way to get them to code exactly in the way
Yeah.
that you want, right?
Yeah.
So if you have like a setup where you have to build similar patterns again and again across multiple teams, and you want everybody to use the same conventions, then I think this can be quite powerful if you have an MCP server just gives you this like perfect
Yes.
organizationally aligned example class
Yeah.
for some patterns, right?
Yeah, yeah. There is a lot of discussion about how documentation changes when
Yeah.
it's mostly consumed by AI rather than humans.
Exactly.
And one of the things is that AI is very literal at using examples versus, I mean, humans, I mean, we take examples as an inspiration, then we do our own thing, while AI often takes the example and makes exactly the same things. And so we had to change a little bit how we build docs, and but it's still very interesting.
Yeah, it's like you have to choose, I think for this reference application, you have to choose a domain that is sufficiently different from the domain that you are using, right?
Yeah.
So if you have in the reference application code that is very similar to the domain, then I think it might get distracted. So I
Yeah.
think it has to be obviously an example somehow, right? I'm
Yeah.
also constantly worried that I'm going to distract AI by, for example, telling it not to do something. I always
Yeah.
think, oh, am I, by saying I don't want it to do that, will I just give it the idea to do that?
Yes, and then you go back. We go back to the thing you said before. That is, you. How do you test for the fact that the instructions you provide are effective, that they
Yeah,
make
yeah, yeah, yeah.
the thing better or the thing works?
Yeah.
You should have your own evals. You know how
Yeah,
the
yeah,
AI is
yeah, yeah, yeah,
performing
yeah,
is.
yeah,
It's
yeah,
very
yeah,
complicated.
yeah. Yeah, I think of it as kind of working with large language models as constant risk assessment, right?
Yeah.
So I think about first so risk assessment is always probability, um, impact, and detectability, right?
Yeah.
Whenever we're doing risk assessment, right? So, and then the probability, then I think about, okay, how probable is it that it got that right? So that's maybe based on my previous experience with Cursor, with Windsurf, with the model that I'm using, with the knowledge. I know I have this MCP server that gives me the samples and it's been quite effective, all of that. So I kind of, what's the probability? Impact is this thing I said before, like the biggest bad impact might be like when I'm on call and I'm being woken up at 2 a.m. in the morning. And the lowest impact is this is just a quick prototype. I'm just exploring something, right?
Yeah.
And then the third one is detectability. Do I have tests? Do I have a regression? Do I, how probable do I think it's that I can actually see what it does? And then based on those factors, I can kind of like do a quick assessment and think about how much review do I want to make, right?
Yes, yes. I mean, it feels different, but actually also similar. I mean, to how you think about guardrails and this kind of things when it's humans doing things. I mean, it's not that different when you think about it.
Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. So we have talked a lot about how to use this AI coding assistants, and I think one of the aspects that confuses many people is about how their role as software engineers changes. I mean, how much they should be on top of the individual code changes because of they should use their skills versus they become more like a manager of code that gets written by AI. So is there anything about how you use AI that is also dictated by how you think about your skills? Maybe you want to keep coding in some capacity. Should engineers think about this or just think about what's the best way to deliver the most impact and the best code possible?
No, I mean, of course, we should think about like how the skills that we have are changing, and yeah, I'm also still not sure. I mean, while I still cannot see that like all code will at some point autonomously be written by AI, right? I
Yeah.
definitely also see the possibility that we might need less people actually building this, right? Although
Yes.
there's this whole factor of like we might actually build more software and then that might just like
Yeah.
even that out again. But yeah, of course we should think about it. And I mean, there are a lot of signs right now that show that the more traditional coding and engineering skills are still quite important, right?
Yeah.
When I was just talking about that risk assessment, a big part of that risk assessment is based on my experience and my scars from the past, right? When I think about the potential impact, I have to think about, oh, this just changed a class that is being called by 50 other places, and that's risky, right? I know
Yeah.
that because I've done this for a while, right? So there's a lot of these traditional things that help me with that. And then in combination with like, now I have to understand the probability of AI getting things wrong, or like when should I reach for AI? When should I not reach for AI? So it's a combination of those things, right? And also when I see the things that AI does wrong, a lot of those have to do with like our risks for long-term maintainability of the code. They're not necessarily like, I might not necessarily see them as bad in the very moment, but because of my experience, I might know what might happen
Yes.
later, right? So my hope is that there will be a short period of time where things might get messy, but hopefully everybody will still learn, right? That's how we
Yeah.
learned, right? We did something wrong, there was something painful, and then we got the scars and we didn't do it again, or like we would recognize it in the future, right? I hope that's still how we'll learn as individuals and as teams.
Yeah.
And more experienced engineers, we can try and make sure that that's as short as possible, and that we support everybody around us, and that we understand how this works, even if we're
Yeah.
even those of you who don't believe in it, if you're an experienced engineer and you want to be a mentor for other people around you, or it's like an expectation in your organization that you help other people around you, then you have to see how this works. You have to use it. If you're just like a lone wolf in the corner, just always building stuff by yourself, then maybe it doesn't matter.
Yeah.
But if like working in a team and helping others is part of your job, then you have to use this to understand it.
Yeah, absolutely. And there are so many, predictions and takes about how this impacts, I don't know, junior developers versus senior developers. On one side, there are people saying this is going to be bad for junior developers because they're going to have a harder time learning things and maybe they can be more easily replaced by AI. But there is also, kind of the dual take that is senior engineers might have a hard time, reconfiguring the way they work to be productive with AI.
Yeah.
So what do you see so far?
Yeah, as I was saying before about the skeptics and the enthusiasts, right? This is also like we have to complement each other, right?
Yeah.
And the one side is the more obvious one, and that everybody's talking about, how will you learn, right? Because there's a really good article in this communications of the ACM, I think was a while ago, about 10 things developers should learn about learning.
Yeah.
And at the time, they already referenced coding assistants to a point. So they were talking about things like how we learn abstractions by going back and forth between details and abstractions. So we learn the abstraction, like what a for loop is, by writing a bunch of for loops, right?
Yeah.
So they were kind of dipping into learning science. And so it was really interesting. I can recommend. So that's one part about the juniors. But I like that you're also asking about seniors, how we might have to change and how we might underestimate this, right? Because we think we're so experienced, right? And I do think this is like a real cognitive shift because of the non-determinism, and we're not used to that, right? We're used to our proper automation and all of that. And so I see some people like kind of trying to shoehorn generative AI into that same space, like being something that automates, and then being disappointed when it doesn't fully do that, or like underestimating the risks of that, right? But it's bringing something new to the table, right? So we have to combine it with the more traditional, like deterministic, stable automation, right? So for example, I sometimes see people polish prompts and workflows and trying to make them perfectly repeatable and into a pipeline and automate it. But if you actually have the premise that you embrace the human in the loop, then maybe that's not necessary, right? Maybe you just have a messy prompt that you use 2 or 3 times and it gets you 70% there. And then that's fine, right? You don't have to put everything into an agentic pipeline. It's a lot of this like on the fly stuff. So that's maybe like one example of where I sometimes see more experienced engineers not quite embrace the different nature and still trying to use it in the way that we use other software.
Yeah, no, totally agree. I think the jury is still out, and I think you can be an optimist or a skeptical, regardless of whether you are a junior engineer or a senior engineer.
Yeah, absolutely. It's all across the board.
Yes, yeah, absolutely. But when it comes to junior engineer, do you think that we should change? Does this change what is expected of them, and we should be more intentional about developing engineers? And because now it's a bit different how we develop software, or maybe in perspective, I don't know.
Yeah, I think in general we have to rethink how we're teaching and learning in the space, right? And like, are there maybe other safety nets that we have to create to facilitate that learning and to more easily find things that you do wrong, right? I haven't thought about it as much yet, but I just recently saw there was a talk by Mary Williams at the LDX 3 conference in London.
Yes.
She was talking about this. I think in the write-up I saw she was referencing somebody else's talk. So, but I think hers was quite interesting for this. So there are some people having good thoughts about this, and Mary is very good at talking about growing engineers and Yeah.
Yes, she's coming to the podcast, so I will ask her.
Nice. Nice call
Exactly
out.
about this. Yes, perfect call out. Thank you.
Perfect. Yes. So
Yes.
please listen to that episode, and because
Yes.
I don't have a good answer to this, I think.
That's perfect. That's perfectly fine. I mean, I don't think anybody does, but we'll see what Mary has to say. Yeah. So thank you so much, Birgitta, for the great chat, and thank you so much again for coming to the show.
Yeah, thanks a lot for inviting me. It was a nice conversation.
Thank you so much for listening. If you found this chat valuable, you can subscribe to the show on YouTube, Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or your favorite podcast app. Also, please consider giving us a rating or leaving a review, as that really helps other listeners find the show. You can find all past episodes and learn more about the show at refactoring.fm. See you in the next episode.